Hello, everyone. Welcome to CSS 1, the introduction to basic CSS. And before we'll start, we'll go into some announcements. So, announcement number one is that homework 1 is due next Tuesday. That should be your HTML homework. So it's due on Gradescope. Just turn it in on there. And then we also have office hours happening all throughout the week. So come by and say hi. The office hour schedule should be on the Notion page. I think it's linked in the Slack somewhere previously in the Basic Stack channel. So just look on there and you can attend in person or online. It'll be hybrid. So now let's get started with basic CSS. So last lecture, you guys learned about HTML, which was in our, if you guys could mute your mics, that'd be appreciated. All right, well, in our house analogy, that was basically, hold on, give me 1 minute. Okay. So in our house analogy, that was basically HTML was the lumber and basically the building blocks of it. It's not a fully furnished house, but it's kind of that outline of it. It's the general shape of it. It's got the basic necessities in place. And in regards to that, CSS is all the furnishment. It's your floorboard, your windows, your doors. It's everything that makes a website a website. So it's everything there. And JavaScript in regards to that is basically your lighting, your plumbing, your heating. It's what makes the house more interactable and makes it an actual house. But you can still have a fully linked website just with CSS. And exactly why would we care? So I'll show you right now. So these are 3 websites that fully utilize CSS. Let me just. So it's the Berkeley website, the Wikipedia page, the WDB page, and the Apple page. And if we remove all the CSS from it, so it's just then basically it just looks like an ugly scrunch of HTML. And then if we do that same for the Wikipedia page, if we remove, we're just purely removing CSS. And again, it's also just a huge chunk of HTML. It's not really readable. It's not something that you would see from a modern professional website. And again, with the Berkeley website, just pure HTML. The Chrome extension, I just searched up a CSS deselector. It just removes all the CSS. I think it's just a JavaScript plugin, so it just removes all of it, and it's pure HTML. And now if you remove it back, then you get your fully modern website, and a website that actually looks good and professional. And that's kind of why CSS is really important, because it's kind of the glue that holds the website together, and it's what makes it professional looking. It's what makes it usable, and it's what makes it CSS basically. Is there any questions so far? No. All right, so CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And it's basically just a list of rules that you give your browser on how to implement certain styles, such as color, font, or even font size or positioning. It's just how your browser renders each HTML element, such as your H1 or your divs. And like HTML, CSS is not really a programming language. It's more just rules that your browser takes in on how to render a certain web page. So even though it might look like a programming language, it's basically just a list of rules to follow. There's no logic associated with it. It's just rules on rules on rules. And so that brings up the question of exactly do we implement it? And so CSS just takes in, it's very simple and follows a common structure. You have your selector, which is just an HTML element. It can be your div, your H2, or your H1. And then for each selector, you have a CSS attribute and a certain value. So CSS attribute can be your color, your font size, your position, and then that value could be red, orange, 10 pixels to the right, to the left. And basically it just extends off of that. There's many CS attributes as our values, and that's basically all it is to it. And each CSS file is divided by selectors, and each selector block contains the following CSS attributes and values. And there are basically four ways that we can implement CSS. One is directly in our HTML file, which is called a class, and we'll get more into depth on what class is and what their needs are and inline styles are. But basically, to implement CSS in your HTML file, you have a pure HTML file, for example, which is what we have here. So right now, just move this out of the way. So it's just pure HTML right now. And to implement it, we just, in our HTML tag, as you can see up there, all we do is just add the class and then whatever our class name is. And that's what it basically is for each HTML element. So we can do the same for our H2. And now it'll have a CSS element associated with it based on its class name. And it's the same thing for ID, but it's a little bit handled a little bit differently. And we'll go more into depth later. So we can call this ID number 1. And now this ID will have an ID associated with it. And there's also another way to do it, which is less commonly used, but it's still available to you. So we can do, for instance, for a first heading, we can do style. Red. And then if we save it, what do you guys think is going to happen to the first heading? It'll just turn red. And that's basically all it is to it, style tag. It's just CSS indicated within the HTML element. And the reason why I didn't use a selector is because it's already inherited from the HTML tag. So H1 here is basically just saying that for this HTML element, H1 HTML element, I want you to style it. I want you to style the color, and the color I want you to style it is red. And we can change that to blue. And we'll change it to blue. And that's basically it for if you want to integrate it within your HTML page. Now, the reason we don't usually do this normally is because if you have a browser with a lot of CSS elements, it can get quite bothersome to read. And if you keep doing it, then at times your HTML page is just going to be a huge chunk of HTML and CSS. And it's not going to be readable. So that's why we have the external style sheet, which we have with the link tag. And what the external style sheet is basically just saying all my CSS rules are hosted somewhere else in another page. And what that other page does is just list a bunch of CSS rules. And it just basically separates the HTML and CSS and makes it more readable and understandable for someone who codes or someone else reading your code to understand what's going on. So right here we have our selected style sheet, and it's basically our selector and our rules, which are going to go in. And that's basically how we, oh yes, come on, you have a question?
Yeah, I just have a quick question on the external style sheet. So the piece of code that you copy pasted in the slide, this is like the HTML part that says that we will link it to the CSS style sheet.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
So right here, for the rel tag, I'm just saying this is a style sheet, and the href, I'm just saying where it's located. So if this was called, for instance, mystyle.css, I would have to change this to mystyle.css, and it'll just look for mystyle.css and grab the rules from it. But for now, our thing is called mystylesheet.css, so that's what we'll name it. And I'll show you guys how it works right now. So let me just get rid of this. So, it shouldn't matter where you put the it shouldn't matter where you put the link rel in the style sheet, but as a general consensus, you usually put it at the top of the head. Like if I put it at the bottom here, it'll still render. Actually, let me just check real quick to make sure I'm not lying to you. So yeah, it should still render because it's into HTML, but you don't like it's just bad practice to do that. Is it possible for HTML to have multiple CSS links? Yes, it is possible, but there's really no need to have multiple CSS links because at that point you're just kind of increasing computation and it's just making it more complicated. And you can just have your CSS style sheet all in one thing, and that way it's a lot easier to read for your browser and it's not looking for somewhere else. And then that way it's all concentrated in one spot. So if, for instance, one of your CSS files goes wrong, then you won't panic and then you can just do that. This is the CSS style sheet and the HTML file have to be in the same folder for it to run properly. Not necessarily. This is where the let me go back to, let me move this. So this is where the href is. If it was outside of our folder, we would just designate it with a // and then folder 1 / style sheet.css. But the .. means just look outside the folder. So a dot just means inside this folder, and a .. means look outside the folder. It's just a file syntax. Yeah, no problem. Is there any more questions? Come on, do you still have a question? Or
I know, my bad, I just forgot to do it now.
yeah, no problem. So now, usually style is used just for like one-time things, and it's not really recommended. So most like 99% of the time you'll find CSS just in the style sheet.css. And the way that .css is designated is just by selectors, which we see here. So you have your universal selector, your tag selector, your class selector, and your ID. And your star selector is just all your CSS class is in the document. And it's kind of dangerous to use, so you only use it for one thing, which is box sizing dash border box. And that just makes it so that your positioning is actually doing what you want. I can't remember the reason why at the top of my head, but if you don't have this, and your website can get a little janky at times with positioning in regards to pixels. So I think that just establishes kind of a main guideline. But I'll show you an example right now. So before we just had that every background was going to have the color brown, but we could also change it so that the font size will be we'll say 40 pixels, and that'll apply to every CSS element. Actually, that's a bad example because it's not alt text. But we could have that every CSS element. Well, what is happening? Oh, that's right. Okay, yeah, so right here, I made that every CSS element has the background blue. So this is in regards to the heading, the div, the h3, the paragraph. Every HTML element has a background color blue. And while this might be desirable, when it comes to like changing things later on, it can be quite tedious because you're gonna have to change it for every CSS element. So it's not really desirable unless you want every single HTML element to have the same attribute, which most of the time is not something you're gonna want. So let me try again. So if I change the font size to 40 pixels, and that's gonna change it to every element, and you can see why it becomes a problem because now every H3, every paragraph is going to have the same font size, and that's not really something you want. So universal selector is something you're going to use seldom because it applies to every HTML element and doesn't allow room for yeah, you can put relative size Kamal and Rebecca. Box sizing border box is just kind of a way to, you don't have to worry about it. It's just kind of a way to make it so that when you shift elements to the left or to the right, or you move it to pixels, you won't get kind of weird errors. I don't remember exactly what it does off the top of my head, but that's kind of one of the first things you do when you start a CSS style sheet is it just makes it everything so it's all from a single guideline. Um, it's all relative to one another. And yes, I can't put it in relative size, so that's usually I'll go to that later, but just to show you kind of a sneak preview, I can do font size is 10 v height, and that just basically takes 10% of the view height. So if your view height, if your which your view height is basically your monitor. So if your monitor was I'm gonna take attendance later, so it can be like in the middle of the lecture where everyone's actually like who was here paying attention is gonna be present. So you can hold off on their presence for now. But as I was saying, the font size, the relative 10VH just takes in your relative monitor, and if your monitor was yay big or yay high, then it'll shrink it down. So there are relative sizes, but I'll touch on that more later in the lecture. So universal selector, as I said before, it's kind of like your world. It adds CSS elements to every HTML element. And your tag selector is a little bit more specific. It only adds to certain tags. So for instance, if I were to add a H1 element that says the color is going to be crimson, what do you guys think would happen to the HTML file? Which elements will be crimson? Yeah, all the H1s. And if we do the same thing for let's say the paragraphs. I don't think I have a paragraph here, but if I have just paragraphs and I change the color to blue, or then all the paragraphs will have the color blue. And the tag selector is just mainly used for HTML elements. So what you use in the previous lecture, so your H1s, your H2s, your divs, it just specifies each div element and it doesn't really differentiate. So all your divs and all your H3s will have the same CSS attribute. So if that's something you want to do, for instance, if you want to make all your paragraphs a certain font size, or if you want to make all your paragraphs have a certain color, that's when you would use the tag selector. And if you go more specific than that, then we have a class selector. And that just, it's kind of a way to differentiate like certain HTML elements. So, and it doesn't matter which tag it is. It's up to you guys. I can share this code with you guys later, but it'll be really helpful if you guys follow along so you guys can see like and actually experiment for yourself. So just kind of switch it. All I have is a index.html file. Yes, semicolons are mandatory in CSS. I think I have a syntax here. So syntax just follows as this. So you have your selector, and then you have brackets, and then your CSS attribute value semicolon, CSS attribute semicolon. Yeah, for sure. I can still share it later. Still share the file later. And yeah, that's basically the syntax. You can, I think if you don't put a semicolon, it'll still render. but you have to be careful with that because sometimes even though it'll still render, you might make a mistake later on. Like you might add an extra attribute, and then if you do, then it'll just mess up. For instance, I can do font size. You can already see it's not working. Yeah, so if you have the last element without a semicolon, it'll still work, but it can kind of lead to some problems later. So generally, just the basic syntax is selector, brackets, and then your attribute, and then your value. So we were talking about classes, and classes are just something that can be shared between HTML elements, and they'll all have the same CSS attribute. So for instance, if we want all HTML elements to have the same color, I'll go with the same color. We'll do with coral. Then we'll basically, let me exit out of these two. We just specify the class next to the HTML element. So for here we have the class name, so it'll be just class 1. And then here it'll be class 1 as well. And then this can be class 1. And it'll make all the elements that same color. So it doesn't matter if you're a div or you're a heading or you're an H3, it'll still be the same color. And that's basically what classes are used for. So classes are just used to kind of like change the way an H3 or a div is. Put class 1, why do we still put H2? What are you trying to ask, Kamal?
Like I thought the point of div was to like give CSS attribute to like all the things inside the div. So you wrote like div class 1, and then the H2 that is inside the div, you wrote also class 1. But like if you remove it, won't it still apply to that H2?
Yeah. So basically, it'll inherit the class from the div. So that's a good catch.
Oh,
Yeah. So it'll still work. Yeah. So it just basically overwrites it with the same class, so nothing will happen. But
yeah, or something, it's gonna like override it, right?
yeah. So if we do it, like for example, in this other div, so I'm in another div, it'll change the color, but it doesn't inherit it from the other div. It's just because it has the same class. But that's something you're going to go over in H2, your next HTML lecture.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think this is a good place to take everyone's attendance because I know some of you are going to leave a little bit early, around 7:30. So instead of doing present, I'm just going to have you guys type, just type in beans, and then yeah, beans. Okay, beans. Beans. All right. Is that everyone? Yes, I think that's okay. And is there any questions so far on the star selector, the tag selector, the class selector? That's a little bit private, so maybe if you become course staff, we'll show you how to do it. But for now, we just have a Python script that just finds everyone's in the meeting chat text. Yeah, so the class selector is kind of like, oh, the class selector. The class selector is kind of like your tag selector. It adds CSS attributes to all your tags, but instead of adding CSS attributes to all your tags, it adds it to all your states, to all your classes. So for instance, if you have an H2 element with class 1 and another p element with class 1, even though they're two different HTML elements, they're still going to have the same CSS attributes. So it's kind of a way to handing, it's like if all HTML elements had a name tag, and then their name tag said, I'm in class 1, then you're going to hand a cookie to every HTML element with class 1, and that cookie is basically what your CSS attribute is. Does that make sense? Yeah, any HTML element, just not like your head or your body, but just anything that's actually rendered within the website, you can add a class to it, and it'll render it. All right. Any more questions? Okay, and then the next selector is an ID selector, and this is very, very specific. It can only be used on one HTML element. So, for example, I have ID number 1 here, and then if I go, if I make ID 1, dark green. And so far, it works kind of like a class element, right? But the only problem is that only that H2 element can have the ID. So if I try to give it to this HTML element, it's not going to work. It did. I don't know why that worked, but generally, like it can only be it can only be used for a single HTML element. And each ID has to have a different value. Like it can't, like you can't share values in the same way you can't with classes. So that's why it's a little bit different. Let me just So in regards to kind of like each selector, your universal selector is kind of like your whole, like it adds CSS attributes to every HTML element in the world. Your tag selector only adds CSS elements to every HTML element in America. And then your class selector only adds it to everyone in the state. And your ID selector only adds it to a certain city like San Francisco. So it just gets more and more specific, and the guideline of where you can use it just diminishes. And you can also group selectors. So if I have two different classes, so if I have class 4, and then I have, I'll make this 60 pixels. And I can do class 1 and class 4. And it'll be shared. So you can basically combine classes to make different CSS elements work. Is it space or comma? It's just a space bar. So if you add a comma, it's gonna break. Yeah, it won't work if you add a comma. That was a typo. But yeah, it's usually a space. So because if you add a comma, as I kind of showed here, it won't like register. It'll just look at class 1 comma, and it'll think the comma is part of the class 1, but it's not really. It's actually just class 1, so that's why it's separated by space. And that's also another thing that I might have forgotten to mention, is that when you have your style sheets in CSS, you can't add space bars. They have to be a certain length with no spaces in between, so it just has to be a single string. So you can't have like big block. Otherwise, yeah, it's not going to work. You either have to add a dash in it, an underscore, or just make it like this. right. And that's all for the selectors. Is there any questions on the selectors? Yeah, Victor, the most specific elements takes priority. You guys are going to talk more about that in lecture 2, but in order it goes ID, class, tag, and then universal. So for instance, if I have a class for this one, I have class 1 be coral, and class 1 is if I give this, for example, I can make an h1 tag class. We'll call this test class, and then we'll give it ID test ID. So if we have with the color green, but we have the ID with purple, it's going to take in the ID and not the class, which, did I name it wrong? Oh, I didn't title it. So yeah, it'll take purple, even though it has a class saying that it wants to be green. So it'll take the ID in priority, and then it just goes from ID, class, tag, and universal. What will happen if I apply 2 classes on one entity and each class this? I think it'll take in whichever class you add in first. So for example, for this one, class 1, let's see, class 1 has color coral, and if I add a color deep sky blue, yeah, I think it'll take coral because coral comes in first. Oh, it doesn't. Um, I think it's on a case by case basis. That's not something you really want to do because I think it'll differentiate based on like whatever your browser decides to render first, which class it decides to render last, or whichever class it decides to render first. So it'll change based on kind of just how your browser operates. So I think it might be the last one. Yeah, it's the last one. So it'll just take whichever last class element you put. Yeah. Is there any more questions before we go to CSS attributes?
Yeah, can you try div class equals class 4 class 1? Just like flip the two.
Yeah. So I think in this case, it'll render the coral. Class 1. Huh. So I think it might just actually take it based on color, like whichever color has an priority over it. That's actually interesting. I've never stumbled upon that, but you generally don't put conflicting classes together. But in case you do, like I think just a browser has it. It has a priority of colors, and you'll probably notice it early on. And then if you do have conflicting colors, I think it should be persistent throughout all browsers. So you probably just have a conflict of colors, but one will always persist and always win. So it's not that big of an error, but it might be confusing if you decide to change class 1 or class 2. So yeah, just don't try to make it conflict.
I have one more question. Can you go back to the ID slide?
Yeah.
It says avoid these as much as possible. Why is that?
It's because IDs can be very specific and then they're not very useful. Like they only apply to one thing. And if you make kind of a mistake, like Like if you want to change a class, but you have an ID in there, the class is going to be overran by the ID. So IDs just kind of get in the way, and there's not really a way to make it all spread out. Like it's the same thing as just using a style class. So what I used before, it's kind of the same thing. An ID and style thing are basically the same thing. It's just saying for this certain HTML element, I only wanted to do this one thing. You can still use them, but generally, like you want to just use classes so that everything's consistent.
Okay, cool. So it's just like easier to read.
Yeah, like it'll let you do it, but just it's easier for a different coder to learn it because a lot of times in web dev, you often share CSS files or you guys are both working on the same CSS files. And it's easier to just look at classes and see, okay, this is what this class is doing. Whereas an ID is just kind of a lazy way of doing it. And yeah, it'll change the CSS and it'll do what you're trying to do. But over time, like the IDs will just add up and it'll be a lot harder like to track down where the ID is. Oh, and then Andy searched it up and then said, if the CSS specificity is in the same conflicting rows, then the later one is applied. So in this case, if we had class 4 before class 1, and class 1 will be applied. Yeah. Okay. So it just basically reads in order. Okay, now that makes sense. Is there any more questions? All right, so let's go on with CSS attributes. I'm sure you guys all saw me just type in like color, font size, or all the other junk I was typing. And that's just basically CSS attributes. So for text attributes, we can have these different attributes. So for instance, if we want to change the font family of an H3, for example, we just go to font family. And then let's go with Times New Roman. And it'll change it to, I don't think I have an H3 anywhere, but let me just add one here. Oh wait, I do. Oh, it's probably because it's already in Times New Roman. But if I do font family, let's do Georgia, and it should change the font. Yeah, it changes the font to this other font. It's not as noticeable, but it's if you want to add an extra font, you can also Google on Google Fonts, and then you can just add it in through there. So there's a lot of ways to get different fonts. And then color, you've already seen me use. Font size just changes the font size of the text. Font weight makes it bold or not bold. The higher the font weight, the bolder it is. Font family, went over that. Text decoration is just kind of like if you want to add underlines to it. So if I want to add an underline, it'll add an underline to it. So for the class 4s, it adds an underline to it, which is here. And then text align just aligns your text. So if I want all the text to be in the middle, so I can have center, right, middle. So if I want it in the center, then all the text will be aligned in the center. So as shown here. And then background just changes the background of it. So background, if I want it like an example crimson, then it'll change it to crimson. And border attributes are in similar fashion, but they're just kind of what surrounds the HTML element. So if we go to a paragraph, let's add a paragraph tag. And then we had a border style. Let's make it solid. So around every P element, there's not going to be a border surrounding it, and it'll be a solid, just black mark. And the same goes with dotted. It'll be dotted, and then if it's blue, it'll be blue. Border weight, it'll be 4 pixels. Border radius, that's just kind of if you want it circular or not. That's also how you make circles in CSS. So if we want to make it a circle, just add a border radius of 40 pixels. Maybe a little bit more. So yeah, you could also make it just so it's a circle now, and this just basically says how much of the border do you want not to be a straight edge, but more circular. And then you can also specify just like if you want just a border on the left, a border on the right, border on the bottom, and that just goes with the coordinates border dash top, border dash left, border dash right, or border dash bottom. And then that seems kind of redundant, right? Like you're typing all these ways to make borders. Well, if you just type in border, you can just specify like how you want the border in specific. So if you want a border that's 2 pixels in width, it's solid, and it's the color red, and you can just do that with border 2 pixels solid red. And is there any questions so far? All right, so we'll go on with position sizing. So this is a little bit more kind of hard to comprehend. Like I don't expect you guys to like get it on the first on the first try, but border and like positions is basically where your HTML element is in position with the web page. So if it's static, that just means it's normally where it always is. It goes in flow with the website. And if it's relative, that means it's basically, you can think of it as sticking to an element. So if you have a div, and then inside that div, you have a HTML element that's relative, then it's always going to stick to that div no matter where it is. So if you put the parent element to the right or to the left, then that div's going to follow. And absolute means it's always going to stay there no matter what. Like, I can show you right now. So if we make this, like we make this web page really long, and we want our H1s to stay in the same spot, we just add position absolute. And yeah, it's I probably shouldn't make it like that. I'll just get rid of all this junk. But yeah, I think I got rid of some H1 elements too. But I think it might be fixed. Fix makes it the same place. Yeah, so if you add fix, then no matter where you scroll on the web page, it's gonna stay like in the same spot. And then if you add absolute, then no matter like what else you add on top of it, it's gonna stay in the same place. So that means it might go over other HTML elements. So you can think of absolute as just kind of like not going grouped with the rest of the HTML elements, just kind of slap it on there and it sticks on there. So you can just kind of think of it as a sticker. Like that sticker goes there no matter what else is underneath it or what else is to the right of it. And you can make it do some cool things, but if you don't have the other HTML elements surrounding it like aligned properly, then it'll just kind of like interweave with all the other things like we have here. And like since it's absolute, it doesn't take in regards other HTML elements. It doesn't take in the margin or like the spacing. So it's kind of like you're just slapping stickers on top of each other. And then if we make it fixed, then that just means it stays in the same spot no matter where you scroll. So for absolute, it's going to stay in the same spot. Like even if you scroll, like it's always going to be on that part of the web page. Whereas fix just kind of sticks a sticker on your screen whereas absolute sticks a sticker on the actual web page. Does that make sense for you guys? Static? Yeah, static is just the default. Static is, for instance, if we get rid of position absolute, and then we get rid of this huge website. And static is just kind of what the HTML elements are already doing. They're just kind of following the flow of one another. They're not getting in another's ways. They're not like being pasted somewhere. They're just giving each other room to go one after the other. And that's just the default that it already is. Yeah, so relative is kind of something you would want to use to, like, it's mostly used, well, I use mostly relative for like, if I want to put elements on top of each other, like if I want to add, let's see. So if I want to add a div element, then I'll call this a parent. And then inside that div element, there's another, and then we'll call this class a child. And that parent, we'll just make it a block of by 30 pixels, and it has a background color of dark blue. And for the child, we want to add like a small little, oh god, we want to add a little small circle, so 10 pixels, and then it'll be white. So if we look at it, it just kind of follows, why is it not white? Well, if we look at it, it just kind of follows the inline of it. Like it's not actually on top of it. They're just kind of side by side. But if we want it go like inside each other, then we'll just make this a position relative. And this is absolute. And why is this not working? Let me try making child one. Okay, I don't know why this isn't working right now, but generally you would just use it to put positions on top of each other. So in a like sort of organized fashion, so instead of just having like elements going all over the place, you'd use position relative for the parent and position absolute, so that the absolute parent sticks to the relative parent, and then they can just, wherever the relative parent moves, the absolute parent moves with it. Did that make any sense, Mira? Yeah, so it's just position relative to its default static position. Like I said, it's kind of hard to grasp the first time unless you guys actually play with it and see what it does for yourself. Like if you try experimenting, like if I make this move from the left by 50 pixels, and because it's in relative, then it's going to move to the left 50 pixels, but I couldn't do this if I didn't do the position relative. Like if I just did left by 50 pixels, it wouldn't move. So to make like basically HTML elements move, you have to do the position relative. And what I just basically says to the browser is when it's in like position relative, it's saying relative to the left side of the screen, I want to move 50 pixels. But if it doesn't have the relative, then it'll just be, I want to move to the left by 50 pixels. And the browser's like, well, I don't know what you're trying to tell me. Like, move 50 pixels from where? Whereas when you have relative, you're like, okay, I want to move relative to where I normally am. I want to move to the left 50 pixels.
It looks like it's moving to the right though.
Yeah, so when you use the left, that just basically means how far from the left do you want to move. So the left in this case is the left edge of the screen.
Oh,
So if I do top, then it'll move from the top. It'll move down. Yeah, it'll move down. So if I do top left, then it'll go top left. Yeah. And if I do to the right, then it'll be to the right. Wherever the right, I don't know where it went. It's probably at the end somewhere. But yeah, it's basically counterintuitive. You guys have any questions on the position? I know it was a little bit confusing. Like, I remember my first time I was confused on how position worked, but you'll get practice with it and then it'll become kind of second nature. All right. And then there's also different kinds of units. So I think someone mentioned if there was relative units, and there are. So that's the rem, ch, ex, vw, vh, and vw just takes in relative size to your monitor. So 100 vw is the full length of the full width of the monitor, and 100 vh is the full height of the monitor. Rem takes in your font size. So if you have a font size of 14 pixels, then one REM is the size of 14 pixels, and 0.5 REM is the size of 7 pixels. And you can also have absolute, which is what I've been using. So it's 30 pixels on your monitor, so it's always going to be 30 pixels long. Like, for instance, here, if I have 80 pixels, then it's always going to be 80 pixels. And if I have something like 40 VH, actually, I'll do 40 VW. I'll do that for the width. And it's going to change it based on how the width of the window is. So if I make it smaller or bigger, then it'll change accordingly. So that's also how you make responsive web pages, is basically with with relative units. Whereas if I just made this 440 pixels, then it would always stay 40 pixels no matter how long or wide I move it. So that's kind of the benefit of using relative units. They're super useful in like making responsive web pages, so that every time you move, like Google sites adhere to, all the HTML elements move accordingly. Whereas if you just kind of had absolute, everything would be the same size, and that's not really something you would want in a modern website. And then you also saw me use height and width, and that just specifies how tall it is or how wide it is. And that's basically just all of the sizing attributes. And background attributes, I won't go over this one that much because we don't really use background image or background position anymore, background repeat. We mostly just use background color. Or if you do have an image, you just do background-image and then URL. Background like repeat and background image is a little bit outdated in my opinion. Like, I have a Space Jam website here and it uses background-image-repeat. And it's as you can tell, it looks super outdated. It's not really something you use anymore. There's better ways to implement it. So for now, I just focus on background-color and background-image, and that's pretty much the only background attributes you'll really need, in my opinion. And we have to specify M before we use rem. You shouldn't. I think it takes in consideration. It inherits the parent element. So whatever your parent element is, it's already going to use that. So, and then we also have color attributes. I've just been using red, but you can also use like RGB, and then it'll do like full, like if I do background color RGB, and then I do 50, 50, 50, then whatever that color is, it's dark gray apparently. So if I do maybe 10, it'll be a different color. Yeah, it's like green. And it just goes in accordance to red, green, blue. You guys don't have to memorize this. Like no one, I don't think anyone memorizes RGB. If you do want kind of a specific color, there's an easy way to do it. Like I personally use, I'll go over this later, like how to use it later. But a useful tool is I just go like here, and then I just kind of like find a color, and then I pick it, and then it tells you like what the RGB value is, so 001. And that's mainly why you would use RGB or RGBA to get specific colors. And RGB, in this case, A, is just kind of your opacity, like how transparent it is. And then you can also have hex, which is the same thing as before. It's just hex, so it'd be like hashtag 0000 would be all black. So if I do hashtag 000000, then it'll be black. And that's just another way to represent colors. Like different colors can be represented in the same way. So if I have, so hashtag 0000 is also equal to RGB 000, and it's also equal to black. So there are just different ways to specify colors, but if you want to get like a specific color, then you would use RGBA, or you could also use hex if that's something that you have. You primarily find it using the web. So if you want to search like for a certain color, you just look it up on what it is. You can have like a color generator, and once you find the color you want, it'll pop up. And the last CSS attribute, we're almost done, is the box model attribute. And this is just the way the browser renders CSS elements. So for instance, right here we have an HTML element with height 40 pixels and width 300 pixels. And that's just kind of how tall or wide it is. And then we have the padding, it's just 10 pixels and 20 pixels, border 2 pixels, and the margin. And so you can kind of think of it as like a GIF box. So the size of the present is inside the box, so that's your HTML element. And then the packaging peanuts are your padding, so that's kind of like how much space the padding takes. The border is just a wrapping paper. It's not going to be very big. It's just going to be like 2 pixels. And your margin is the distance to another present. So if you kind of like take a look at that, you know, each HTML element is that GIF box, and each GIF box has different different presents, size of presents, different amount of packaging peanuts, different wrapping paper, and the distance to another present is also very different. But the only thing you see is the present itself. So the packaging peanuts, the wrapping paper, and everything else is invisible to you, and it's only things that you set. So for instance, if we want everything to be 60 pixels apart, then each present is going to be 60 pixels apart. And if we want the padding, so the packaging peanuts, to be 60 pixels apart, and that's going to make it very big because there's more packaging peanuts to go inside, and that's just basically how much it is. And do we have any questions for the rest of the CSS attributes? Rebecca, I don't think the default's actually 0 pixels, because if it wasn't, I think everything would be bunched together. The browser, or in this case Chrome, actually has its own default. So if we take a look at it, yeah, so for H2, I didn't add this. This is just kind of like the browser. The font size is 1.5 EM. The margin from each, so basically the distance from each present is 0.83 EM. And these are all things that I didn't add, but it's added by the browser itself. So it's not exactly 0. So if you did make it 0, so which I can do right now, then everything would be kind of stuck together. So the default isn't really 0. It's some arbitrary amount. It varies from browser to browser, of course. And now,
can I ask a question?
yeah.
Just what's the padding again? What do you mean by packaging?
Yeah.
Oh,
So padding is kind of just, I can show you right here. So if I add like padding, then the padding is that green thing. Like it's just like what's inside the HTML element. Like how far do you want the like how squished you want the HTML element inside the B. So if I do it something like 100 pixels, then it's gonna be very squished. But even though like all the other like the wrapper of it is like still the same, but just like there's a lot of packaging peanuts inside it. So the HTML element inside it is super tightly packed and it's in the middle.
and if you add a border here, can you just like add it so we see it?
Yeah, like I can add so I'll make it. Yeah.
Oh, it's just literally the border. Okay.
Yes. So if I get rid of it, then you can see like there's no padding. But if I do add the padding, then yeah.
Thank you.
And then if I add the margin, then that's just kind of like how separated it is from everything. So yeah.
Thank you.
All right. And then is there any more questions? All right. And then how do we memorize all this? You generally kind of don't. You mostly have kind of like over time you'll kind of become accustomed to like what CSS attributes work best, like what to use, like color, position, all that. But mostly at first you're probably going to be using dev tools a lot, which is kind of what this is. So to open it up, if you're on a website, like if you're making a website, this will be your index HTML. So you just do Command Option I on Mac. And I think it's Windows Shift I on Windows Shift I on Windows. Yeah, okay. And then that's basically it. You have your elements here, which are every element, and then you can, instead of going to the style sheet, you can just add stuff here. So for instance, if I want this H2 to not have a padding anymore, and I want it to be a different color, then it'll move. Or if I want to see how it would look if I add a padding of 30 pixels, and I can see. Or if I want to see how a background of, let's say, gray would look, and I can see that. The only problem is that it doesn't actually save to your CSS. So for instance, if I reload this, then it'll go back to normal. So the way you do it is you can copy and paste your CSS elements from style sheets.css, or you can just kind of add it in as you go. So that's the only caution I have, is that like if you are tweaking it and if you are switching CSS elements around, just be careful because it doesn't save. So
Just is this the like inspector and other web pages, or is that different?
yeah, you can do it for I'm sure you guys have like probably done it like when you were younger, but like if I go to Wikipedia, and then you can also do it by inspect element, inspect, it's the same thing, developer tools. And I just make it like the background chocolate or yellow green. That didn't do anything. Let me try this. Yeah, it'll change it. So that's for any web page.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then Mira asks, is it better to change a website like this? Yeah, it's just kind of a way to just improve your workflow, because if you're doing it on CSS, you can't really see the visual changes until like you reload it. So if I, for instance, if I want to change the font size to 10 pixels, then I'm not gonna know how it's gonna look like until I reload it, and then I do it again. I'm like, oh, 10 pixels not gonna work. Maybe I can do 15 pixels or 16 pixels. And I go to 16 pixels, and I see that doesn't work. So maybe I should try 20. And that doesn't work either. So, and then whereas I can just kind of go here, check it here, and then 14, nope, 12, 11, 10 is what I'm looking for. 110 is like 10 is what I'm looking for. So it's just a way to improve your workflow instead of kind of having to write CSS, save it, look at it, write CSS again, save it, look at it again. You can just open your dev tools and then tweak the CSS. Is that what I want? No. Tweak it again, tweak it again, tweak it again until it's what you want. So it's kind of just like a mock-up of moving things. And in my opinion, it's kind of better that it doesn't save it, because sometimes you mess up and you can just reload it and then see what you actually want. So yeah, but yeah, to save it, you do kind of have to transfer it, which is kind of the bad part. But you can just copy and paste it, like, because those are the changes you want, so it'll be easier to. And is there more questions? All right. So in summary, CSS is an essential part of development. Without it, all our websites will look meh and just be a piling garbage of HTML. It follows basic syntax. It's just your selector, your brackets, and then each CSS attribute followed by colon and the value and the semicolon. And there's a lot of distinct attributes and values, and it can be hard to remember what each does. And that's when we use dev tools to our advantage. And that's basically pretty much what CSS is. It's just a list of rules to follow with different colors, different positions, different paddings. And when it's automated together, it makes websites like all the ones you see on the internet. And that's pretty much it for a CSS one. You guys have any questions? All right. If that's it, then you guys have a good rest of your night. And don't forget that HTML homework #1 is due next Tuesday. So just do it before then, and you guys should be good. All right. Thank you guys for coming. Have a good night.
Thank you.